Please welcome to the stage Snorkel AI's co-founder and CEO, Alex Ratner, Commonwealth Bank of Australia's Chief Decision Scientist, Dan German, CIBC's Vice President of Advanced Analytics and AI, Ozge Yeloglu, and our moderator, Brunswick Group's Caroline Daniel.
Hello again. So I've just been finding out in the green room that two of the panelists abandoned their PhDs to set up a startup, and one of them completed their PhD. I don't know who wants to guess which is which. Do you want to put your hand up who actually completed their PhD?
I can promise that was a big disappointment to all of our venture backers. It's not the not the preferred pathway.
At least it shows you've all been experimental in your own careers in terms of what you've been doing. I thought what we'd love to start with is basically what needs to be in place to enable really great experimentation.
What needs to be in place? Good people. I'll say the right people in the right places with the right mindset, right? And definitely the infrastructure as well, right? The right infrastructure, right tooling, and especially in large enterprises like banks, also I will say a good executive sponsorship, right? Because you don't want to only experiment for the sake of experimentation, but you really want to make sure that whatever you're experimenting with sees the light of the day eventually.
I'm going to take the same question to you, Dan. Is this working?
Doesn't sound like it.
Same question to you, Dan.
Let's experiment. Does this work? Yes, it does. There we go. The power of experimentation live. I think there are so many things, but perhaps the most important and one of the most kind of difficult to really kind of measure or plan for is cultural. So I think about the sort of Commonwealth Bank, and thank you very much for having me, by the way, all the way from Australia. Short hop, not even 10,000 miles, mere 9,929, I think. But at Combank we've been deploying AI at scale for a very long time, and I think the most important factor in all of that has been understanding that in order to deliver results for your customers, you need to be able to experiment. You need to understand the impact that you're having. So being able to culturally have this idea at all levels within the organization that new technology that you're implementing can be very powerful, but it's important to understand what's the impact that you're having. Really, this is the most important thing about any organization that's trying to transform itself through AI. So I think the cultural aspect of the organization is probably the most important factor we've found.
So given how important, can anyone still hear me? Hopefully I'll get a new mic, Luke. Given how important culture is, can you just actually give some specifics on what you've done to actually enable that culture?
Sure. And so there are many different things, but one really great example. So we've got more than 2,000 machine learning models in production across many use cases. And, historically that's been the preserve of experts in AI, machine learning engineers, data scientists, and so forth. And, it's quite a complicated thing to do, has been historically. We invested heavily in making sure that we could democratize AI using automated machine learning and empowering our people who are somewhat data literate, but not necessarily, I don't have a PhD, as we've already established, but certainly people who don't have PhDs in advanced AI, but are data literate and want to learn. And we've invested in tooling that allows them to be able to develop machine learning models in areas where they are experts in the subject matter. And so a great example of this is, we created at Commonwealth Bank something called Benefits Finder. In Australia, large numbers of government, state and federal rebates are available, but people don't always know how to access them and what they're entitled to. So we created tooling that just allowed them to understand the things that they might be entitled to. And using this experimentation framework to know what was the impact, we generated $1.2 billion worth of value back to customers' pockets. And the team who were devising that capability used machine learning through the tooling that we've created in an experimentation framework to drive a 124% uplift in the number of customers engaging with the tool. And that's something that's only possible because we thought about having access to AI for everybody in the organization, not just the preserve of technical specialists.
And Alex, what's some sort of key takeaways about what actually is the best thing to have in place to drive experimentation?
Well, I think it's working now. Okay, I don't know if I'll just talk louder. I don't think Sorry? I handed off.
Try this one.
There you go.
For the good of the group. Is this working? There we go. Okay. Well, now I just got an awesome fashion accessory with this headset. It's great. So I think, obviously I want to plus one the comments about the importance of, culture. And I think one thing I want to pick out there is the cross-functional culture. I mean, I think this is kind of like a marriage counselor-esque statement, but one way to kind of tell that a project's going to fail. We work with 7 of the top 10 U.S. banks who work across many different verticals. If we parachute into a new team, if there's not a good connect between the data science AI team and the subject matter experts, the SMEs, that project is very unlikely to succeed, either in terms of accuracy at kind of the AI level or in terms of business value, obviously, in terms of deployment. So I think that cultural, all the cultural aspects you mentioned, but I just wanted to double click on that. And then from a kind of technical perspective, I already got typecast here as the nerd since I was, a sucker enough to finish my PhD. I would say it's all about evaluation and kind of, making AI more, making AI development more driven, like, by tests. Test-driven development needs to come to AI. And the key to that is, well, it's bringing SMEs in the loop and it's getting, good data to evaluate against so you can know if you're moving in the right direction and if that direction is connected to something that's not just a higher number on an accuracy score, but also some business value. So start with the ROI, the business case, back that into one or more metrics, the finer grain the better, that you can actually measure against, and then actually measure your efforts against that. That sounds kind of basic, but especially in the Gen AI world, a lot of stuff is done via, bless you, what are I think technically called vibe checks, and kind of deploy an app and see if some people think it looks like a cool demo, versus actual quantitative metrics that are connected to those business kind of ROI indicators. So I think that set up good evals. Shameless plug for what we do there, which is help label, curate the data to power those evals, and then actually be rigorous about evaluating against those. When you have that set up, then you can go wild, especially with today's technology foundations in terms of experimentation.
And how do you think about the structure in place to actually get really great experimentation? I mean, are you very ROI driven? Is there a matrix in terms of how you assess all the multiple projects? And how is it getting more hard when actually you've got so many people across the organization now wanting to do experiments? And how do you prioritize the sort of different politics within an organization of who wants to have a sort of cool experiment happening in their division?
That's a great question. So it's the hype definitely increased, right? So there's definitely more demand. But even before the demand at CIBC, it was never AI for the sake of AI, but it was always about the value and what's the value that we're generating through this technology. And a few years back, we actually put together a couple of tools, and one of them is our business opportunity assessment tool, and another one is an AI value calculator. And through these processes, we first look at the opportunity. What is the business opportunity that we will create while solving this problem, right? And then our business partners bring us the problem to the AI teams, and then we assess the opportunity with them. We ask multiple questions during this assessment. And some of these questions are like, what's the potential value? And value doesn't always have to be revenue generation, but is it cost reduction, loss avoidance, loss reduction, any kind of value that we would generate for our bank? Is there an executive sponsorship for the project? Because we know when there's an executive sponsorship, there's always a better path to deployment and production and getting these tools in the hands of our end users. And many other questions that way, right? And then first we assess the opportunity, and if the opportunity is good enough, then we start working on it. And then we thoroughly assess the value as well, right? We built a calculator to figure out how are we going to create or assess the value.
What does the AI value calculator actually look like? Is it fiendishly complicated?
It is an Excel sheet, I'll tell you that. It is very much of an Excel sheet with multiple components that we take a look at it inside in it. But eventually, and frankly, the challenge with the value, yes, we can always say we're going to generate this much value upfront or during the process, but measuring and tracking that value is, I would say, one of the current challenges that we all have.
Dan, do you have some kind of very clever AI calculator to assess what you're doing and deploying at the bank for experimentation? How do you sort of start?
I think one of the temptations in this field is to try to be intellectual about every single challenge that is presented to you. We're here talking about experimentation, and the scientific method is predicated on that and has been for at least since the 16th, 17th century, and empiricism goes back way beyond that. And so we think about measuring things carefully because it's important to do that. But actually, I think one of the things that is dramatically undervalued in industry is this idea that really everything boils down to people. So the people that are developing the capability and for what purpose, and more crucially than anything, the customers you are serving. And so in the example I gave previously about our Benefits Finder tool, the $1.2 billion of benefits and rebates that we reconnected customers with, it wasn't CBA's money, and there was no obvious direct imperative to do that. But if you think about the journey of AI maturity of our bank, which has been happening for a long time, you look at the performance of the bank over that time, by doing better and better things for customers, turns out to be incredibly powerful for us as an organization. And so when we think about experimentation, we're thinking very clearly about trying to improve customer experience and measuring the impact of that and knowing that we are having the types of positive customer experiences that we want. And thinking about human-centered AI is probably one of the key things for us, I think, in this regard.
So, Alex, what do you think people are getting wrong about experimentation? You obviously work with a lot of the banks, and you see it from the outside in. What do you think are teams which are not set up well for success? What are some of the lessons?
I guess I covered. I want to Ozzy, what you said about actually having a value case and having some exec sponsorship. I mean, we think about that maybe from the other side of where we land with accounts and how we actually vet. Is this a real opportunity where we're going to lean in and do a POV, or is it just window shopping and experimentation? I think some of our best partnerships have happened when both sides are thinking from that lens, right? It's very tempting to run lots of demos and science experiments, and even when you get that piece right of doing good empirical evaluations of the model performance, let's say, great, 99% accuracy, and then you go off a cliff of realizing that 99%, even if it was 99.9, won't actually connect to any value. So, kind of starting there and working backwards. I also definitely the point about not just not forgetting the people and not reducing everything to numbers, but obviously part of our job is to provide some of the tools for yielding those numbers. So starting with that value case, we don't. We're not driving that, but we're often assisting, and then connecting it to, some kind of performance metrics. And if I double-click on that, I think one area that people are getting wrong these days is just trying to find kind of push-button shortcuts for getting those numbers, right? I've seen a lot of projects where a team is going to great lengths to kind of build a specialized AI application using their data and their expertise, but then they're just trying to use kind of an off-the-shelf model to kind of judge the accuracy. A little in the technical weeds, but it's kind of like saying we're going to go through great lengths to onboard some new grad, but then we're going to pull another random new grad off the street and have them grade their exam or their performance. So thinking about evaluation as also something that needs to be specialized, tuned with your SMEs in the loop. Number two, being fine-grained. Actually, we published a paper back in 2017 when we were back at Stanford with the Siri team. Siri's, I don't think, cool these days, but they were at the time the largest, global or really Gen AI application back then, a chatbot. And most of their work was about, not improving towards some global metric of accuracy, like everyone's competing about in the space these days, but rather kind of breaking down the specific types of queries, the slices of the data we called it, where performance really mattered. So being specialized with the evaluation, being fine-grained with the evaluation, kind of with a product manager mindset of what are the actual capabilities that this Gen AI app has to do, and not just what's the one vanity metric score that obviously is, or that often is not even that important. I think those are kind of the mistakes. So it's number one is not you got to be connected to business value. You have to be, you have to have some kind of metric to develop against. But that metric can't just be a vanity number. It's got to actually be fine-grained and specialized relative to the actual outcomes you care about, which takes a lot of thought up front. It's not just the data or the tooling, it's the product management and business thinking all coming together.
So let's look at sort of the macro world. Obviously, it's changing all the time, every single day. There are more and more LLMs who have different capabilities. Open source can do everything that LLMs could do a few years ago. How on earth do you keep up with the kind of capabilities out there when you're baking in early experimentation and then also when you're moving it to deployment? Obviously, we heard this morning about the need to be sort of model agnostic in many ways, but that's often pretty hard. A lot of people have signed very large enterprise deals with the large LLMs, and they don't want to look stupid. So can you just sort of unpack how you're starting to have to think differently about the kind of relationships, long-term agreements, contracts you're having with startups, because you don't want to get stuck with the fact that it's all going to be redundant very quickly?
Yeah. Look, it's a tough one, right? And it can get very expensive. Very expensive if you want to be truly model agnostic. But this whole experimentation and the pace of change, I always say, like, what we've been doing in the AI space and the builders of AI have been called data scientists, right? And I always say that there's the word science in it, right? And that's what we do, science. So we are very used to experimenting and trying out different models. It's just that pace has accelerated a little bit with the Gen AI these days. And yes, we all have to keep up with that. And yes, our data scientists are constantly looking at every new model that is being published every 6 weeks or so these days. But being model agnostic, in my opinion, is very much going back to monitoring piece, right? If you actually have a solid model monitoring environment that you can have, then the next thing is, like, when you know a model is not performing or you have something better, how easy it is to be able to take that one model out and bring in the new model in. And in my opinion, it is very much of an infrastructure and the right tooling in place to be able to do that. It's not easy, but it's very important.
Sorry about the rather weird ghost in the room. Dan, what about from your assessment of model agnostic, how do you deal with the pace of change as you're thinking about how to prioritize experiments?
Well, I mean, you absolutely need to, and we have very consciously at Commonwealth Bank for a long time been able to pick and choose what's the right tool for the right job. And I think that's incredibly important, more so now than ever. And so obviously we have our own proprietary Gen AI studio. We can bring the best of what's out there in the market. We can very rapidly experiment with those. We can build our own.
Can you tell us a bit about how that studio is working?
Sure, incredibly well. And so we have many use cases already in production. And I think this is an important marker of maturity. So I think as a bank, GPT-2 came out in 2019. We were using that. Turned out it was a bit rubbish for what we used it for, but we learned a lot. I got it to replicate one of my presentations, and it got it broadly acceptable 1 time in 100, but we knew this was coming. And so when ChatGPT was launched and people started to become more aware about this more broadly, I think our first use case of the published model was a couple of months later, customer-facing. And so our ability to execute quickly through experimentation is sort of proven through the amount of different applications we've been able to deliver. But I think that, to expand a little bit on my point earlier about what I mean about this idea of measurement and science experimentation, I think critically important, the question is, what are you measuring, right? And so I think this is what I mean by the sort of fixation, and it's understandable. We have lots of smart people in the bank, all the banks do, and doing very important work in academia with the partners, looking at the performance of the model and, how big is the context window and, what's the speed of response and what does it score on this benchmark versus this benchmark. All of those things are important, but the most important thing is what's the output that you're trying to drive. And this is what I mean about the importance of human-centered experimentation, because that's what delivers the outputs that you're trying to drive if you're very smart about the way that you're measuring impact, the impact that you're trying to have. And so, Combank, there are a couple of use cases for Combank that are taught at Harvard Business School. There's one on behavioral science around the unbank-like experiences for transparency on credit cards. And there's another about more advanced AI through customer experience. And when you combine the two of those, this is what our human-centered AI team are doing, and it's fascinating. So we have this concept of a wind tunnel, much like in industry. If you're building a plane or a car, you want to test it in real life, but it's expensive, and you want to test it safely first. And we do this, and we see some fascinating things in the field of AI. So we created an experiment, and it's just to 1,000 Australian people brought into the survey, and we just create a kind of scenario, and it was around trust in a dispute process. So a lot of banks will have this kind of process where you dispute transactions. And what we discovered was that if the customer got a negative dispute reaction, so say we're not going to recognize that as a disputed transaction, you paid for something, you would see 10% reduction in trust if you said this was driven by AI. And if you said it was driven by AI with a human in the loop, there's about a 17% bump the other way back to trusting. But if the customer got a positive outcome, it made no difference at all whether the decision was made by AI or by human or human in the loop or anything, and was actually 117% more trusted. And the system, was abstract. There was actually no system. All we were testing was what would you feel if you got accepted or not accepted. And so that kind of experimentation allows us to think about the application of generative AI in particular and how customers are going to respond to the way we frame messaging, what's the impact it's going to have on them, and that's what really drives value for us as an organization.
And Alex, sitting sort of in a different part of the tech stack, particularly on the data side, which you started as an afternoon project when it was very unsexy to be thinking about data and data labeling. I wonder if you can sort of go back to that moment in time in terms of understanding that actually what really mattered was something which was very unsexy and people aren't focusing on enough. Perhaps people don't think about data labeling as very experimental. Can you sort of just give a perspective of looking at the banks from a different perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less of a controversial point when it comes to folks that are actually in the field, especially in an industry like banking and FSI more broadly, where you have these stockpiles of very proprietary data and very proprietary knowledge and expertise about how to go about using that data and carrying out your business. The idea that would be valuable, that would be some of the most important non-commoditized delta in the space of AI, less controversial here than it is in some of the big labs and in academia, both now and a decade ago when we started. But from the that perspective, a lot of the shift over the last 10 years, I'd say, is from our perspective has been AI going from kind of being model and algorithm centric to data centric. It used to be that data was something that you didn't think about. We didn't teach anything about it. We started to change that at Stanford, UW, and some of the places that our folks have been at. But data was upstream janitorial work. I literally remember I think I just told you the story, but briefly, I'll repeat it quickly. One of my buddies who's now on the OpenAI 01 team, and OpenAI is one of the largest spenders on data labeling and human data collection, I think right after talent and GPUs, like most of the LLM labs. But back then was saying, are you sure you want to do work on data in an AI lab? You're never going to publish. Your career is going to kind of be in jeopardy. And well-meaning, he's still a very good friend. But that was kind of the prevailing attitude, was that AI and data science was all about tweaking the models and the algorithms, and the data was from you get the line of business team to send over a spreadsheet or download it from the internet on some data set. And we've kind of seen a complete 180 in terms of how models are actually developed, both at the labs, doing the pre-training, post-training for the kind of big generalist base models, open or closed source, and then in the enterprise of actually then specializing and evaluating those models. very few teams actually go and try to pick up the toolkit that we used to teach of tweaking an algorithm or coming up with a new model architecture. Almost no one. This includes, we work with a lot of the big LLM developers, providing them with data. They have very few people proportionally working on coming up with new model architectures. I've colleagues on the academic side who do work there. It's a very exciting area of post-transformer model architectures. But by and large, whether it's an enterprise like a bank or an LLM developer, like a Meta, Google, et cetera, they're reaching for data as the toolkit. Data to evaluate, and then data to tune and potentially pre-train, but for enterprise purposes, mostly prompt, tune, develop, to fill the gaps. So this flip from data is janitorial, and models and algorithms are what AI people do, to basically the opposite. Models and algorithms are black box. They are effectively commoditized as we get to steady state with the right modularity in place. And the data that you put in, the data that you evaluate, the data that you put in for tuning, for prompting, for in-context learning, et cetera, is the toolkit for developing AI. That's something that has kind of pretty unambiguously become the reality, but it's still not quite sunk in. We still don't teach it in an AI course. We talk about, how to build a new model architecture that no one is ever going to do in practice. So it's still a shift, I'd say, we're undergoing in terms of the practice of AI and data science in the wild.
I'm just going to pick up on that. I'd be really interested in from both of you about the perspective between how far your data scientist team want to work on kind of the latest stuff, and that's what helps them kind of get their next career job, versus actually working on maybe some of the traditional techniques which are actually you need to experiment or to work out how to deploy them at scale. So how do you get that balance right between the kind of the new thing and actually experimentation around traditional models of which actually are more relevant now, may be cheaper to deploy because of the new capabilities?
It's an interesting one, right? Because I've seen kind of the both sides with our team members. Like some are much more eager to just try the new things and then and test and experiment and get their hands dirty. Whereas I've seen some just saying, well, it is what it is. Anyone can do the LLMs these days. It is just an intelligent app design in a way. You can make a call, API call. Is it really, data science? And then some are almost like sticking with the more traditional AI approaches, what they want to do. Look, in the end, it's and I can't say one way or another because both sides have the right perspectives on their own. With the Gen AI, I absolutely think that there is the component of the intelligent app design and the AI becomes less of a thing in the background. But it is important. It is important to the person who's doing it, who's leveraging it from the data scientist perspective, where they want to take their career to, and how they want to engage with the tools that they're working on every day. But as the leader or as the business owners, it is very much use case dependent, right? There is no one solution that fits them all. There are actually complex enough use cases that we have to leverage both techniques, right? You do your traditional AI up front, and now you're going to leverage Gen AI because it gives you so much power and efficiency in the end of the solution. So it is the combination, it is the right and good balance that we have to find.
Yeah, I love this question, and I'll tell you why. So I've been working at the Commonwealth Bank for about 8 years, and around about 5 years ago, we decided to consolidate our data science capability and rethink the way that we propagated that out throughout the organization. And at that point in time, the capability that we had within the teams, incredibly well credentialed, real experts, globally recognized. But the engagement in the level in the team, we measure it, and it was something like 40%. And for example, the female ratio in the teams was about 13%. And there was simply no impact from that team. It was just not culturally aligned to what we want to do, and therefore finding it very difficult to have an impact. Fast forward now, the engagement within our team still equally, in fact, I would argue now much, much stronger credentialed than we've ever had before. Incredibly capable experts, globally recognized experts. The engagement is somewhere around 90%. Female ratio in the team is about 40%. And the impact that we're having is phenomenal, and it's because of culture. My point again, the most important thing in terms of driving and the most undervalued thing in large organizations is how much of the business is just all businesses are people businesses. And so you think about the work that we're doing right now in generative AI, a great example, we've got a fantastic use case in using generative AI to create response letters to customer complaints. So when you complain, it can be quite complex. So we like to get back to customers very quickly with that. We've understood your complaint. We understand it to be this. Is sorry, right? We'll get back to you. And we use generative AI and it made it 100 times faster to do that. And so we're very excited about this because we think, well, this is going to provide a better customer outcome. And then we were using, NVIDIA capability to fine-tune some models once we had this live to understand even more about how it was operating. And what we found was it was actually, in some times, the capability that was going live for customers, some of the evaluation metrics about readability and other things about the impact were lower than they had been in the previous iteration. And when we investigated, we discovered that the members of staff who are the humans in the loop, and they still, we're not automating the sending of the emails, we're just shortcutting a lot of the work for our staff to check the emails, write it, and send it. They were making, in some small instances, certain pockets of them were making big changes to the template, and actually, by the evaluation metrics, making the emails kind of less readable as per the sort of standardized tests. But what's really important is, what is the customer receiving on the end of it? Why are they making these changes? Are they like language differences that they know will resonate better for a customer because they deal with customers all the time? And our team are fascinated by this. So while they get to work with the latest state-of-the-art equipment, hardware, models, and they're very motivated to be at a place where we're driving these things into production, what really gives them fulfillment is the impact it has with customers. And I think that's key to having kind of, top experts in the field feeling as though they really are excited about working within an organization like a bank.
I'm sorry to stop your flow, because obviously you're in peak enthusiasm about what you can be doing with banking and AI, which is a great way to end. We've run out of time, but we haven't run out of sandwiches, so we're going to go and stop for lunch now, and please join me in thanking our panel.